great, it's a lovely dream, but you know, haven't got the CPU. And I'd hear this so often that it become a mantra. It just become a kind of thing that people say, hey, no, I haven't got the CPU. And when you analyse that position, when you look at it in any depth, especially after about 2006, 2007, it's nonsense. Yeah, it's actually one of those somewhat political and philosophical now, but we tend to latch onto positions in life, like I say, a mantra, and that's your stock response to something, and you don't realise how much the world has changed. So one thing that humans are really bad at is this exponential curve business. We see how things are progressing in terms of computational power, and we have this mythology that there isn't enough CPU power to do that, because for a very, very long time that has been a valid argument. But all of a sudden you look around and you've passed that point, you know, part in the curve where not only do you have enough CPU to do it, but you've got more than enough. Now your processing systems are solutions looking for problems. You've got more capabilities than you know what to do with, and you've got management running around saying, hey, what can we do with all these cool chips we've got? So there's a massive make-up project to kind of fill in this audio that kind of people haven't looked at for ages. Okay? However, the constraint I had was to do it very, very efficiently, and to do it in the goal I set myself was, look, if you've got a 1 gigahertz machine, let's say that you divide that in half, you give half of it to the graphics, and I'll have 500 megahertz left to do the audio. So the objective is using a 500 megahertz machine in Intel 86 architecture machine with a gig of RAM, produce all the assets for stock standard video game. And that was about the next time I disappeared into a tunnel and didn't emerge for about 2 years. Came out around about 2006 with a full set of assets for a game, all of which would run on this 500 megahertz machine in real time. And crucially explored what we might call the parameterization of them. How would you interact with these sounds? How would that code then go into the games engine and be attached to the objects in the world? So this presentation is some of these old results. Most of them made it into the textbook that I wrote on the subject. I then spent a long time kind of thinking around this as an emerging area with some research topics. It turns out that just synthesizing the sounds is kind of the beginning. Now you've got all these other huge problems. How do you make use of concurrency and parallelism? How do you create tool chains, and how do sound designers interact with these? Which kind of led me into the subjects of cognitive, psychology, cognition, sonic interaction design, all of these things about how we relate to objects as sounding objects. Have you heard that expression before? Essentially, it comes from a project by what I call the Italian school. So this is David Ricesco and some of these guys from, they did a big project called the Sounding Object Project. And I just mention this because I think this terminology is quite important. Sound objects is something that we reserve, we leave for Schaefer, because he means something slightly different by sound as objects, yeah? What I'm talking about when I say sounding objects is things like this table. Yeah? It has, let's think of it as an object, and it has a bunch of methods. One of them is you can hit it. It has a collide method, which invokes some kind of physical process going on there. There's an exchange of energy, kinetic energy coming from the impacting object, exciting it. And we could look at all the different objects in the world, split them into some taxonomy, and think about how do they interact, not just with the main actor in the game, because everything in a game is kind of player-centric. You know, you're the actor and you act upon things, but objects also act upon each other. So there's a fairly well understood, a fairly small list of interaction modes that we might want to explore. Collision is an obvious one. There are things like scraping, the stick-slip friction modes, familiar from a bow on a string. Many of these have a historical lineage, a genealogy in other areas of music research. Acoustic properties. How do they behave in a gas phase acoustic as a cavity, you know, for an incident sound energy that's going to sort of bounce around inside them. Completely non-linear things like fragmentation. What happens if you break one? If you break something, you know, it now becomes several pieces, and each of these pieces becomes a sounding object in itself. Rolling, bouncing, crushing, where the object changes its actual, you know, shape and thus its modal behaviour. These are all, in a way, rooted in physics. So this is one part of procedural audio, is to understand ordinary objects in the world. And I guess this is where it generalises most of the work which has already been done in the kind of previous 50 years. When you look at lots of audio and signal processing research, it's been conducted in music departments and has been specifically aimed at the modelling and reproduction of musical instruments. What we want to do with the procedural audio projects is to completely generalise this, to talk about any ordinary everyday objects, the sound of footsteps on the floor, the sound of birds twittering in the park, the sound of fluids, of water, of raindrops on a leaf, of a pool of water, of pebbles colliding together. Everything that's in our ordinary world. Can we interpret this in a structured and rational way? Can we provide efficient models? Can we embed them into a virtual reality? And can we make them so that we can sensibly interact with them? So that the behaviours that we might have as a character and actor in the game, or the other objects may have, produce realistic, meaningful sound. So I guess I've kind of, I didn't really want to rely on these slides. One of the reasons is that I'm kind of forced to turn around and I don't want to have my back to you, so I'm kind of giving you the skinny more verbally. What I'm going to do is to go through a bunch of these slides now and talk, just try and unpack some of these concepts. At the moment, how does this sit with people? How are you kind of happy with these concepts? Cool. These are from a presentation I did a long time ago, so I apologise that they're kind of out of date. Let's just have a look at this one, see why. Yeah, here's a kind of good argument, is growth. The data problem with growth is that the worlds just keep getting bigger. The worlds keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the current kind of games are basically sandbox games. They're unlimited, essentially, and they'll even generate the world's geometry on the fly. So you have, you know, going back to the early days of generative work in Frontier, in Elite, you know? This was procedural worlds generation. So you'd have space, and you wanted an infinite number of worlds. So you could always go and visit a new planet. This is kind of grist for the mill now in terms of who remembers Bryce? Who remembers these kind of world-making tools, which could actually model erosion, weather systems, flora and fauna, all the various kinds of ways that the land, the trees that might grow. And you just kind of leave it with an evolutionary algorithm, with some genetic algorithm, and come back half an hour later and you just have like these beautiful mountain ranges with like little bunnies jumping around on them and trees growing and flowers and things. Remember that? I mean, this is old technology now, so we've got this kind of built into our games technology. So you can have these endless sandboxes. But the audio assets are still data-driven. Now the problem is that it's combinatorial, it's a polynomial growth. If I've got two things, I've got A and B, and I have to bind a piece of data to an interaction between them. Let's just take the case of collides. A collides with B, and let's assume symmetry. So A hits B is the same as B hits A. A nail hitting a hammer is the same sound as a hammer hitting the nail. Which may or may not be the case. You look at some of Perry Cook's studies. very interesting to break this causality apart. Just given that, now we have 3 objects. You know, you can see we've got polynomial growth. Sure, I got 3 interactions, but I put it up to 4, and hey, hold on, I got 6. You know, and so the order of growth of the interactions is polynomial with respect to the number of entities in the world. And I'm going to very, very quickly end up with a need for more sound assets than I can shake a stick at. So we can't rely on the scalability of data. With that comes the management problem. You know, each piece of data has to be recorded, tagged, screened, selected, given a name, put into the engine, bound to an event, then tested. You know, to sort of see if it works or not. One of the really interesting side effects of procedural audio is that we get unexpected results. We get results for free. So we design a framework in which a bunch of things interact, and there may be events in the world which we have never foreseen. With this whole deferred form thing, there may be future interactions which we haven't anticipated, but sure enough, when they happen, they go, oh, that sounds right. It's within the expected parameters. Whereas with the data, we have to exhaustively test them as well as possible. Another interesting side effect that's kind of related to this is what me and many other researchers now I think have settled on calling, as an acronym, LOAD, L-O-A-D, as level of audio detail. I used to call this dynamic level of detail and things. I think LOAD's kind of cuter. So in graphics, if something's a long, long way away, it's not drawn in very much detail. It just makes me like that Father Ted where he says, no, Dylan, that's very, very small. That's a long, long way away. When it's a long, long way away, hey, it's very, very small. So, you know, the angle of the data's coming from means that that's all squashed into a smaller texture. We can use a lower bit depth and so on. Well, what about with sounds? You know, at the moment, using a data model, no matter how far away that sound goes, it has constant cost. So if I'm playing back a sound sample of something that's very close to me, I'm using the same 44.1 kilohertz, the same data throughput as I am for a sound which is almost inaudible on the threshold of my hearing. So one of the other interesting research topics which falls out of the procedural audio project is level of audio detail. Now there's been some interesting CGraph papers in the last few years kind of looking at this. I think it's a huge area. It overlaps with compression and with perceptual audio. So it overlaps with kind of the MPEG masking-based lossy compression techniques. But it has a completely different philosophy. Instead of analysing given data and breaking it up into some dictionary and saying, hey, where's the redundancy in this? It starts from the bottom up with the model and says, what do I actually need to communicate from this model to the end listener? So, for example, rain. I've had a couple of students do projects on rain. Rain really breaks down into 3 rings, if you like. These sounds which are very highly detailed, which are very close to you. They're within 50 centimetres. And one of my students found out, very interestingly, that when you hear the rain, it's actually the ones that hit your shoulders which are the loudest. It depends on the clothing you're wearing. You hear these raindrops in, and on your ears. You know? And then you kind of have this ring around you as a second level of detail. Of course, raindrops don't make any sound on there, right? There's no sound of raindrops, right? There's a particular impulse signature on the objects which they hit, so they excite them modally and so on. So you have the sound of rain on wood, the sound of rain on the ground, and so on. And then, as we go further out, we've just got noise-based approximations. So these thousands of raindrops in aggregate become nothing more than nicely spatialized noise with the right kind of spectral send for it and so on. So can we come up with a single model which is capable of moving seamlessly between these? Very interesting research project. This involves dynamically reconfigurable DSP graphs and some rules for adding and taking away complexity, so that as the droplets become very close to you, we get far more computational detail in the signature and the modality of the objects they strike, but in the distance we can subsume them in aggregate into a kind of texture, a general effect, and just say, hey, well, it's kind of raining over there, so we'll have a bit of noise in the background. Okay, I'll just move on to the next point. One of the objectives here is realism. That is a huge topic in itself, which we could unpack and talk about for days. Most people think they want realism. They don't. Okay? You don't want realism. You think you want realism. You don't want realism. Okay? This is what sound designers know. Sound design is all about smoke and mirrors. It's about trickery. It's about emotion. It's about connotation. It's about metaphor and simile and context and image. A lot of the time, a one-for-one physical simulation is not the way to go. So if you like, there are two schools of thought already within the procedural and computational audio research area. There are what I would kind of call the, well, I've used more philosophical language, but I'll kind of state it in plain speak. The hardcore realists, and this is the kind of lot of the work that's done at Cornell. Incredible stuff. If you look at the work of Doug James, Zeng and James, they're doing things like, getting incredibly efficient, boiled down models, but they are full-on models of, say, fluids or fragmenting objects and things like that. Trouble is to make 1 second of sound, they're kind of using a Linux Beowulf cluster with, it's taking them 28 hours to render a couple of seconds. So this is kind of the CGI as it was in the late 80s, if you like. We're still waiting for that Tron moment, I like to say, where suddenly this stuff just goes real time. But I don't think it's going to come from here because the philosophy that backs it is kind of wrong. Yeah? I go for what we might call does it work? Yeah. Pragmatic, maybe, possibly the wrong word. Does it work? Kind of approach, with which comes the potential for huge efficiency, huge efficiency. Yeah? So I'm talking about replacing a couple of 100 megabytes of sound code with a small bit of runtime which occupies 10K and it doesn't even make the CPU sweat. It doesn't touch the CPU. Yeah? We can run 100 instances of this thing. And this is the kind of realistic way to go to get this stuff into the games arena, because only when you can. Audio always comes last, right? I don't know if any of you have already worked in the business, but if you haven't, as you go into your career as audio people, you'll discover this interesting culture. It's everywhere. That if you're doing your job exceptionally well, and you're working at the peak of your creative and productive capacities, the best compliment that people will pay you is that, what sound? They won't notice you. That you're not there, yeah? The sound was transparent, That's the best you can do, is not to be noticed. In these what we might call synchronized media, games and film and things where sound is the secondary element. So given that, what we discover is that within the business, sound always comes last. Not just in terms of its position in the talk chain. It's purely historical that we have post-production. Post-production's because location sound sucks. Because you've got directors shouting and people stomping around, and it's really hard to have good microphony and things like that. And so we have this whole culture that we've developed DAWs and post-production, and we synchronize after the fact and do ADR and things like that. But in games, if you think about it, in games and animations, what reason is there for sound to come last? There's really none. In fact, the very few directors who get this, and we're looking at the kind of, the top 1%, whose work is absolutely outstanding, are all really into sound. And they talk about sound at the script writing stage. They get the character animators in, and they get the actors, and they talk about the sound from the beginning. Sound is built into the process. the truth about the realistic situation that you're facing in the game, certainly in the games and animation industry right now, is that sound is an afterthought. Yeah? Procedural audio challenges that big time. It comes right up and says, no, we're not going to you can't just add on sound as an afterthought. Sound is built into the model. So the interactivity of your characters and things like that, you kind of need to build this in. Okay, I'm not gonna unpack any of this more because we could go on for a long time. Are there any questions about why we'd like to do something as insane as this? I don't feel like you're sceptical enough. I think you're too charmed. I think I'd like some. Where's the resistance? Come on, guys. It's difficult. It's a difficult project. Okay. There's such a lot to think about. And at the moment, it's very limited. How many games have you actually played with procedural audio content in them so far? You may not know that you've played games with procedural audio content in. Probably it accounts for less than 1% of the material that you've heard at the moment. They tend to be casual games. The games industry is fairly risk averse. They don't really kind of just jump on new, contrary to the mythology, they don't generally jump on new technologies. The business of making games is getting title shipped. And in a world where kind of 96% of them fail and cost you huge amounts of money, embracing new technologies is something that's much too risky. So it creeps in at the lower level. You kind of see this on, what's the latest one? Oh, Pugs Love Beats. Has anyone seen that? Jan Sesnick's latest thing. It's one of these musical and sound-related games where your interaction with the world creates sound music, and the music is kind of part of the game. I always think that things where it's really hard to explain what they are, they're good. You know, you have to play it to then think, oh yeah, hey, that's good. You know. Right, let's see some examples. So I guess we're done with this. I got some, yeah. Talk a little bit about. Let's pick an example. Let's talk about maybe the footsteps one. I think it's a solid example because it's a lot of people when they talk about sound effects immediately go, oh, Foley. No, Foley. Jack Foley speciality. It's a very particular thing, you know. Foley is the is personification of character through sound in the movement of the actor. So it kind of expands to clothing sounds, but it's generally footfalls. And Foley artists usually like to sit and they like to watch the video, and they like to have a pair of shoes and a box of gravel, and they like to act it. Good Foley artists are kind of dancers or actors and kind of have this ability to caricature and characterize things. So it's a performance art, right? Well, what we've got here is a poor shadow of that. But one of the things I've really enjoyed on my journey in procedural audio is that I get to look at really interesting research done by other people in completely unrelated fields. So I found myself reading through stacks of papers on the bipedal gait of the bonobo monkey in Amazon, you know, and it's kind of some biologist has followed monkeys around taking casts of their footprints to find out how they move their body weight around. And this whole subject kind of unfolds into a fascinating study of bioacoustics. That there are kind of different kinds of movement. You have like predators who move their weight as evenly as they can over the foot. They creep. There's a mode of movement called creeping. You know how cats, you watch cats move, the back foot comes into the previous footfall so that it knows that it's already been compacted. The objective here is to minimise the acoustic energy, not to be hurt. Contrast that with fight or flight, which is where you're startled, you're accelerating away, you sprint, and all the work is done on the ball of the foot. So the objective here is to maximise locomotion, is to move or accelerate as fast as you can. Walking is a strange thing that humans do in the middle, which is the most efficient form of movement, is to reduce the degree to which the centre of gravity moves away. So we can analyse all these different kinds of movement and see that there's a signature process. This is a key concept in computational audio, is that there's often a signature process, a driving variable, which kind of sets the scene for all the other ones. And in locomotion, this is called the GRF, the ground response force. This is the pressure over a certain area as the foot moves on the ground. So we can plot these, and there's been kind of, you can dig up the research papers and you can see these graphs. They kind of look a bit like, oh, don't draw on that. This, so you've got three humped curve. Why? Well, there's really three parts to the foot. There's the heel, which contacts the ground first. Then there's the outstep. You move the weight across onto the outstep, and then onto the ball. So each of them has a kind of different surface area. And there's also 2 feet, right? Now, when you're creeping, the feet hardly ever leave the ground. This back one just comes forward really quickly, yeah? When you're running, it's a controlled fall. You're just bouncing along on the balls. Yeah? The actual contact time is extremely short. And when you're walking, you have this kind of overlap of heel and ball. So we've got a phase relationship between the feet, and we've got a phase relationship between the components of the GRF. Wow, this already got really complicated, right? Before we were just kind of thinking of footsteps, you know, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. We'll just have 2 sounds and trig on them. So our model now is intimately linked to the behaviour of the actor. What's missing? Well, if we ignore the actual feet, the footwear, then the next thing is the ground. Is the surface on which you walk. So what causes a sonic emission from the material? You know, crushing processes, grinding processes, stick-slip processes, things like that going on, impacts. We've got a whole range of stuff we want in the game. We've got metal walkways, we've got concrete, we've got wood, we've got grass, dirt, snow, classically difficult one to do. Yeah. And all of these can be interpreted in terms of their sonic production with a process which is driven by this signature, this GRF. So this is a very simple model that I've made here, where we have, let's just see if we can hear some of this maybe. It's the audio one. So we've got somebody stomping along. What's actually going on inside here? Let's kind of have a look. I'm just going to slow the angle down.